Welcome back, I'm Kimberly and this is Floral Art Online. This week in our Designs Dissected series, where we have DesignEye, our AI, look at our designs, the two designs on offer are Cascading Beauty and Contorted Control. Both are judged all around and both are contemporary designs and both were place getters, but you'll hear more about that a little bit further on. So if we look first of all at Cascading Beauty, the staging for this class was a plinth 40 centimetres square and a metre off the ground. We were not height restricted, so I could have actually had this cascade all the way to the floor, but we were only allowed 60 centimetre width and depth, so I had to be careful of how much volume there was at the top of the design if I wanted to have it cascade down. Now this, as a contemporary waterfall or cascading design, it needs to look like it's coming down from a top part of the design, and so it makes the placements quite challenging because you've still got to have a water source and you still need to get the scale and the proportion right. So what I've done here is an underlying structure is a metal stand, which is a round tray at the top, and there's some floral foam taped onto that. This was in the years when floral foam was still acceptable to use in designs. The stand itself I've pushed into a piece of freestanding heavy bark, which I've used in a number of other designs that you'll see on the website. Let's see what AI has got to say, DesignEye has got to say about this particular design. Looking at colour first of all, the design is dominated by a rich dual tone palette of deep pinks and greens. This creates a dramatic and eye-catching effect, with the pinks adding warmth and the greens providing a natural contrast. So it's a soft design to look at in terms of the colour palette and our eye being comfortable with it. The stems and branches create strong vertical and diagonal lines, while the woven elements and the flower petals introduce a softer and more curved lines. This creates a dynamic interplay of form and movement. Shape now. The design incorporates various shapes, including the roundness of the blooms, spiky forms of the greenery, and the irregular, almost skeletal shapes of the woven elements. This diversity adds visual interest and complexity, and that's one of the things that can be challenging when you're doing this type of design, the cascade or waterfall design, is that the elements that give you that cascading look are often very similar in shape. So I'm glad that I managed to overcome that challenge in this design. Texture. The textures in the design are varied and tactile. The flowers have a soft velvety texture, the woven elements have a rough woven texture, and the greenery ranges from smooth to spiky. This interplay of textures creates a depth and dimension. So one of the things that we always want to have in our designs is a bit of depth, and the thing that can be quite challenging when you're focused on the design style. Space. Now, the design utilises both positive and negative space effectively. The dense clustering of flowers and foliage creates a sense of abundance, while the open spaces between the woven elements and the branches allow the eye to rest and appreciate the individual components. So balance. The balance of the taller branches on the left and the downward flow of the flowers creates a sense of balance. So that's good because we wanted it to look as though it was bursting out from the top of the waterfall and then cascading down. Emphasis. The focal point of the design is likely the cluster of pink blooms near the top, as they are the brightest and most saturated element. The downward cascading movement of the arrangement also draws the eye towards this point. Movement. Now, the design has a strong sense of movement, with the lines and shapes guiding the eye downwards in a cascading motion. So exactly the movement that I wanted in this design, so the judges would know that it was a cascade or a waterfall design. Proportion. The design is well proportioned and the scale of the elements feels harmonious and balanced. Rhythm. There is a sense of rhythm created by the repetition of the pink blooms and the woven elements. This repetition creates a visual pattern that leads the eye through the design. Unity. The design achieves unity through the use of a limited colour palette, the repetition of elements, and the overall theme of cascading beauty. Now the unity area when you are judged is very much about repetition, whether it's repetition of colour or plant materials, that will make our mind think that it is all part of one thing, so we get that unity feel to it. Looking at improvements now. So the design could benefit from slightly more balanced distribution of the visual weight. This could be achieved by adding a few more blooms or foliage elements to the left side or by adjusting the placement of the existing elements. It's interesting that the physical judge, in the feedback that I got, asked that the colour elements of the flowers continue further down in the design. She felt that it stopped short of being a full cascade, and so that was one of the reasons that it placed second rather than first. The focal point could be further emphasised by using a slightly different colour or texture for the central cluster of blooms. This would help draw the eye and create a stronger visual anchor. So it's talking about anchoring your eye at the top of the cascade and then letting it follow the foliage and the plant material down through the waterfall. I can understand that because the top, to me, when I look at the image now, looks just a little bit messy, a little bit not unified, I guess is the best way to put it. So I would take that on board and have another look at how I could incorporate a different set of placements, or perhaps, as they're saying, a slightly different colour. So introduce a colour that will draw your eye and anchor your eye at the top and then allow it to follow through. So we're looking at the tints, tones and shades of those pinks that I've used in that design. The summary now. Overall, this is a visually striking and well executed floral design that effectively utilises the principles and elements of design. The arrangement is dynamic, interesting and evokes a sense of natural beauty and abundance. With a few minor adjustments, it could be even more impactful and visually appealing. So I would agree that whilst it is a cascade and it does look like it's falling from that top section, that the back element and the top element just needs a bit of tidying up, just needs a bit more unifying, as we say. So let's now go on to our second design, Contorted Control. This next design for DesignEye to analyse was titled Contorted Control, and as you can see from the image, it was staged on a plinth. Now the plinth is 400mm square, but the space allowed for the design is a metre square, so you actually have to have a base that will support extending out past the edges of the plinth itself. So my idea around it was to indicate with the plant material that it was contorted, but it was controlled either by nature or physically. I've used predominantly palm inflorescence, so because when it's on the tree, it actually has lots of contorted shapes which have occurred with nature and the wind and the elements twisting them around, because they're often at the water's edge or where there's a fair degree of wind and water happening. And they also lend themselves to soaking in water, so you can actually shape them to use in your designs. By binding them with the tatami matting technique, I've got a long piece that can be twisted through the design, but also I left one end long so that you could see that part of that placement was controlled and part was still contorted in its natural way. The bark has natural contortions in it, and I've picked out plant material that I had, so that the bulrush that I've kept for years just in the off chance that I might be able to use it sometime, and it's obviously bent over itself, so it has been contorted by nature. The controlled element is the foliage, which is very structured in the Xanadu leaves and the Westeringia leaves that I've used. We were, with this design, required to incorporate roses. So these have been contorted around the other plant material in the design. Twisted flax and tortured willow circles hang from the design as well, just as an additional manipulated or contorted element. The design itself placed third, and the judge on the day said that she would like to have seen more contortion in the design as a whole, and it appeared, because it's judged all around, it appeared to be two halves of a design when she viewed it from certain angles. So it's a thing to keep in mind when you are being judged all around, that you make it interesting from every angle. It doesn't have to be the same, but it has to be interesting from every angle. So often I will work on something that you can see through the design, so you can see something from each side that you can't see necessarily when you're standing in front of it. So let's now see what DesignEye thought of this particular design. looking at line, first of all, the design is dominated by strong dynamic lines created by the twisted branches, which is good because that's what I wanted to show. These lines create a sense of movement and energy, drawing the viewer's eye upward and outward. So once again, something that I wanted to happen in this design. Form. The overall form is asymmetrical and organic with a focus on the vertical dimension. The various plant materials and structural elements create a complex and multi-layered composition. So that's pretty good feedback. Texture. The design incorporates a variety of textures from the smooth glossy leaves of the monstera to the rough bark-covered branches. This creates a sense of visual interest and tactile appeal. Now, I've left this particular comment in here because I want to talk to you about when you are submitting your own images for analysis, just to remind you that we do review the analysis that comes back from the AI just to make sure that all of the elements are correct, because obviously it's looking at an image and it will match the image with whatever else it has in its intelligence that it thinks is a good match, and so we still review them just to make sure. And so in this case, it's identified that the Xanadu leaves are actually monstera leaves. So before it came back to you, if this was your design, before it came back to you, we would have adjusted that to make sure that it reflected your particular design. So back to this one, colour. The colour palette is primarily green and brown with pops of red from the roses. This limited palette enhances the focus on form and texture, which is great because I hadn't actually thought of that, but it's good to see that by limiting the colour, we're actually making the analyst or the judge look at what other things are important in the design. So texture and form have created the intent for this design without me having to do it with colour. Balance. The design achieves a sense of balance through the asymmetrical arrangement of the elements. The heavier visual weight on the right side of the design is counterbalanced by the strong vertical lines and the upward movement of the branches. Now that may well be because I only give it one image to look at. So in fact, when we're looking at something that's judged all around, we should be giving it the 4 images of each side so that it can look at the way it would look at it if it was a physical judge on the day. Proportion. The proportions of the design are well considered with the various elements working together to create a harmonious whole. Emphasis. The focal point of the design is the cluster of roses at the top of the structure. The roses are highlighted by their contrasting colour and placement, so this is probably not as obvious from this angle of image, but this is the image that the AI was given, and so it's honed in on the fact that there's red at the top there, which is different to the rest of the design. And so it has placed the emphasis there at the top, which is probably okay. I wouldn't want the emphasis to be anywhere else in this particular design, so that's fine. Unity. The design achieves a sense of unity through the repetition of lines, forms and textures. So once again, as we looked at when we talked about colour, it's that you can have repetition and that creates unity, and we've talked about it in the earlier example from Cascading Beauty, that it doesn't have to be colour that makes a unified design. It can be the repetition of something else, some other element, design element. The various elements work together to create a cohesive composition. We look now at suggestions. While the current scale of the design is impactful, experimenting with different scales could offer new perspectives. A larger, more imposing version could amplify the drama and energy. Experimenting with different placements for the focal point could create alternative visual pathways and narratives within the design. So if you've looked at some of the other series of these analyses, you will know that we have talked about scale and proportion. And in this one, the analysis is saying that whilst the proportions are probably right, the scales are not right in terms of size. And when you look at it, having that comment in the back of your head, you can see that that's true, that it's just a little bit out of scale with itself. You know, there are some elements that are quite large and some that you really have to focus on. So the way to get around that with a design of this size, when you're limited to this size, is to, as it says, and make it a larger, more imposing version, so not use so many of the small elements, and that can be achieved with this same plant material by massing them together. So having a massed grouping of the palm inflorescence, having a massed grouping of the Westringia foliage, a massed grouping of the Xanadu leaves, and then the other contorted elements being massed in one area, and just having those placed so that they blended in together. But it gives you much more impact, and there's much more drama in that kind of a presentation. So it's certainly something that I would experiment with next time there was something along these lines in terms of a class title. So the summary overall: Contorted Control is a successful floral design that effectively utilises the principles and elements of design to create a visually striking and emotionally evocative piece. So very different to some of the other summaries that we've had, but I'm happy with that as a summary of the design itself. It is, and I did try to make it visually striking. Emotionally evocative is probably not what I was going for, but that's okay too. So there we have our two designs for this week: Cascading Beauty and Contorted Control. As I mentioned earlier, you are more than welcome to submit an image of one of your designs and have analysed, and we do, as I said, review those analyses before they go out to you, so we make sure that they are as useful educationally for your floral art journey as possible. Until next time, I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Online, Designs Dissected.